Good morning, Vincent. Hello, I'm Anne Green. I'm one of the trustees of PPEF, Private Physiotherapy Education Fund, and you have been one of the recipients of our grants in the past. So I was hoping that we could talk to you about your work and how you've benefited from PPF funding. So in a nutshell, could you tell us about your research?
Perfect. Hi, Anne. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss that with you today. So in a nutshell, what I basically set out to do in my research was to investigate what strategies might work to reduce the risk of shoulder injuries in rugby union players.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so how did you approach that research question?
So I used a framework that's used in sport injury prevention. It's called the TRIP model, which basically looks at translating research into injury prevention practice. There's 6 steps, so it's about identifying how big is the problem with some epidemiology surveillance work, looking at any etiology or mechanisms of injury, developing a preventative measure, testing that, and then more importantly, looking at how we can implement that into the right context and evaluate its effectiveness at the end.
Great. Okay. And what sparked your interest in that sort of area, in rugby and injury?
So growing up as a youngster, I played rugby and had a shoulder injury myself, which stopped me from playing rugby ever again. Ended up having shoulder surgery done. And I think that was where my sort of passion lies in terms of having had the experience myself. And as a clinician, as a physio myself, I tended to think that, you know, we can do more from an injury prevention perspective. Initially, I was keen on return to sport, but that's a lot harder to kind of evaluate and do research on.
Yeah. And what methodologies did you choose?
So there were about 4 or 5 different studies involved, and what we basically looked at was some epidemiology work initially, so fairly straightforward quantitative methods, and then there are a few other studies that looked at further quantitative methods, and in the final study we actually looked at doing some mixed methods, looking at some survey-based work with the participants.
Okay. And what were your key findings? What are your implications for practice?
So looking at the key findings, I think, you know, from the epidemiology work, we're able to identify a particular group, so the semi-professional players having the higher incidence of shoulder injuries, shoulder sprain, dislocation, and AC joint problems being most common. I think what we already know from research more broadly is that the static and dynamic shoulder assessments that are used are not very reliable and shouldn't be used alone in making clinical decisions. But most importantly, the work highlighted the process involved in developing preventative interventions, using research evidence, having input from a technical project group, stakeholders, and doing a pre-study trial. We then implemented that in a pilot study. And what the pilot study basically showed us is that you can get higher adherence in the youth population to an injury prevention program if coaches prescriptively implement the intervention. Additional to that, the coaches need assistance with scheduling the preventative intervention into their training sessions, as they have concerns about a lack of time to do so.
Great. That sounds very straightforward. I'm sure it wasn't. And what's next, Vincent, for your study?
Yes, so I was very blessed to, on completing my PhD, I went on to do an evaluation project for the CSP and Health Education England, where we looked at the role of exercise professionals in supporting AHP services in the NHS. Very different to my PhD work, but a research opportunity all the same. So that was presented at Physio UK last year. And since then, I've also been successful with an early career researcher award at UE in Bristol. And that's basically looking at adherence to shoulder rehabilitation exercises, and I'm starting to kind of build on that as we're going through that project at the moment.
Great. So finally, how did the funding you received from PPF support your work?
So the funding from PPF was immensely important because it provided that financial support that enabled me to register for a PhD. It also allowed me, or sort of provided what I needed to meet the financial costs involved in carrying out the research. I think the funding was helpful in supporting me to attend international conferences, to disseminate my work, and also to build my research network. I think the whole process of submitting an application and being successful with funding also helped me develop that very important skill of writing future applications for funding. I think over the course of the PhD, which I did part-time, allowed me to present my work at Physio First conferences, and that was an opportunity to share what I was doing with colleagues in practice. And for that, I'm forever grateful for the support from PPEF.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm glad that the funding's been helpful, and you're doing clearly extremely valuable work. And I hope that this short interview will encourage others to look at PPF as a source of funding and look to ppef.org.uk. I wish you all the best with your future work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne.